Okay, you can all see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Great. So before Rachel gives her talk, I just want to introduce myself and introduce Metaculus as a platform for a bit. I think most of our attendees are very familiar with our platform, but I think some of you might be a little unfamiliar with it. So I'm just going to give a super quick introduction to the platform and how this project got started. Yeah, so my name is Juan Cambiero. I'm the COVID content coordinator at Metaculus, and we're extremely happy to host this speaker event. This is our second speaker event of this kind. Last week we had Professor Thomas McAndrew of Lehigh University with us to present our joint work on soliciting and aggregating expert predictions on vaccine and therapeutic solutions to COVID. And this week, of course, we are very pleased to have Professor Rachel Aicher with us to discuss risks relating to the upcoming US election and how likely they are to materialize. So again, I'm just going to give a super quick introduction to the Metaculus platform and forecasting generally for those of you who might not be all that familiar with it. Forecasting, of course, is the tool, practice, and process of making predictions on future events. It's probabilistic, meaning you handle uncertainty quantitatively, for instance, by expressing, in this case, a range of when you think a new Supreme Court justice will be confirmed. It's Bayesian, meaning you update your beliefs as you encounter new evidence, and it's an acquired skill, meaning you get better with more practice, which is a great reason to join Metaculus. And what's Metaculus? So we're a platform that solicits and aggregates predictions on all sorts of questions, mostly relating to science and tech, though clearly we also have election-related questions. And we have a community of thousands of users, many of whom share insights with one another and collaborate on their prediction making. Anyone can sign up to make predictions, and users can also propose new questions. And they work with our moderators to come up with some background, good question phrasing, and clearly defined resolution criteria. And of course, users accrue a track record based on their performance. So the more accurate you are in your prediction making, the lower your Breyer score will be. In this case, I'm displaying the track record of the Metaculus platform, specifically that of our Metaculus predictions that are the result of aggregation. And that aggregation process that I just mentioned involves first identifying which forecasters are likely to make accurate predictions on a given question based on past performance. And then two, incentivizing our forecasters to participate and to do well by incentivizing accuracy using some combination of reputational awards and sometimes monetary ones too when we host tournaments that have prizes and the like. And then three, we aggregate all of the individual forecasters' predictions to produce the Metaculus prediction, which is the consensus prediction I mentioned earlier. And finally, we repeat this process for many different questions across a variety of topics. And so what everyone wants to know, of course, is how do we do? Here we have a calibration plot, which is one of the ways you can see how well calibrated our consensus predictions are. So as you can see on the horizontal axis, that tells you the probabilities we assign to each event, the probabilities of each event occurring, and the vertical axis tells you how often these events actually happened. So essentially, when our predictions say that some event has a certain chance of happening, those types of events will happen at roughly that rate. So for instance, as you can see here, for example, only 2% of events that were assigned a less than 5% chance of occurring actually happened. And that's consistent across different probabilities. And keep in mind, in particular, the calibration at low probabilities, because as you'll see, it's especially relevant to this project. Just quickly going over some benefits of participation in case you're not already involved. As I mentioned in the first slide, a good way to get better at prediction making is to make predictions, is to actually get started. So you can really hone your forecasting skills. you immerse yourself in the latest research, the latest news, because a lot of our users tend to share information in the comment sections that we have. And I usually find those to be extremely helpful. You can help guide decision making. So in a lot of our partnerships, we've collaborated with public health agencies, for instance, on COVID-related projects. In this case, with the election risks expert survey, we've shared it with different election security experts. So really, you'd be part of the process of informing decision making at various levels. And you get to be part of a community. So as I mentioned, we have thousands of forecasters, and many of them chat with one another, many of them know one another, and it's really, I think we really have a nice community. And here I just included a little screenshot of the Metaculus Discord that we have. So going into the election risks project, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge some of the past work that has informed the how we actually came up with the project and the different kinds of questions that we asked. So I'm sure a lot of you, if you're forecasters, are very familiar with Nate Silver and his election model. He had a tweet a little while back on, he was trying to inform the commentary on like what the different scenarios would be for different election related risks. So that really helped inform and guide my thinking. There was this Law Journal article by Edward Foley, who's an election security expert, and it's a from a legal angle, very intricate and very well-defined scenario analysis of different kinds of risks and how they would materialize, potentially materialize. And then, of course, there's the Transition Integrity Project, which was a project that occurred this past summer, which was essentially scenario planning. They had a bunch of former government officials and assigned them different roles to go through what might potentially happen during the and after the election. And all three of these people and groups have really informed our thinking and the kinds of questions we've asked. So our main aim with this project, based off of, in large part, all of the great work that I've mentioned, was to really map out the different kinds of risks more quantitatively. To our knowledge, no one has really tried doing work on what the probabilities of these different risks actually are, which is something we think our platform is extremely useful for. Secondly, we would like to inform the planning of decision makers and the general public. Obviously, this is an extremely timely issue, and there's a lot of uncertainty regarding how likely these different risks are. And finally, this is an important part of developing the infrastructure around these collaborations between subject matter experts and top generalist forecasters, and something we expect will continue to be important going forward. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Aicher. She is a specialist in democracy, human rights, and governance issues. She is an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Political Science at CUNY Hunter College, where she was actually my professor, and a great one at that. She has reported on Egyptian elections during the Arab Spring, and she's observed polling in Brazil and Jordan while working for the US Department of State. She got her BA from Harvard, her MPhil from Oxford, and she currently directs advocacy and partnerships at the International Legal Foundation and is a New York City poll worker. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Aicher.
Thanks so much, Juan, for that introduction, and thank all of you today for joining. I think in the attendees, there's also a few of you joining who have actually contributed. So I want to also thank you guys, especially for taking the time to make this research possible and for sharing your expertise and your thoughts with us today. I'm just going to pull up a few slides and then talk through our study in a little bit more detail, share some of the findings, and I also want to be really mindful of times that we can allow for some conversation and questions from everyone who's here today. So just a moment as we do share screen. All right, and can everyone see that, Juan? Does that look good for folks? Great.
Yeah, it does.
Perfect. So, just as we start out the conversation today, I just want to pause and, let everyone in the audience take a moment to think, what are you concerned about when it comes to the US election this fall, if anything? Maybe feel free if you want to throw some ideas in the chat. We'd love to see what you've been thinking about. We, of course, tried to think through what some common experts are concerned about, what might be relevant, but curious to see how well we captured some of the concerns that have come up for you guys as well. So obviously 2020 has not been an ordinary year, and this is part of what inspired this research to take place. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has killed over 225,000 Americans as of today. It's infected over 8.7 million people across the US. And of course, Metaculus has been an important part of thinking through what some future scenarios might be for vaccine production and for other issues. So, this is a platform that is very much already engaged with these issues. But this public health crisis also has massive other implications when we talk about economy, and the US political landscape as well. So we've suffered massive job shocks. There's been the Black Lives Matter movement also in 2020, which inspired widespread protests. Some cities have experienced violent clashes and unrest. And overall, just so much remains uncertain. And this makes it a very different year from other years that we've experienced in the past. And it's in that kind of overall context of uncertainty where we think, well, what's different for this election? How will this election happen, given that we're in somewhat uncharted territory? So first off, a couple of things that have been different. We have the broad expansion of vote by mail and absentee ballots, and early voting in order to accommodate health and safety during the pandemic. We continue to see a shift to social media becoming much more important even than traditional media in many cases, and that's shaping how information flows and public perceptions of the election itself. Massive concerns about misinformation, narratives of fraud and rigging have been voiced by high-level leaders. And we also recently had the Supreme Court's makeup change. So these are all factors that when we think about what might happen in future scenarios and when experts are making their predictions, they're considering. And then looking at this election risk survey in particular, what we were trying to accomplish and how we designed it, first off, of course, just a huge shout out to Juan for all of the work that he put in and the team at Metaculus for really bringing their platform and their expertise and their ability to bear, as we thought through how to frame and create the framework for this study. So in terms of goal, really, we wanted to identify not only which scenarios are possible, but which are probable enough to merit attention and resources for planning, prevention, and mitigation. This is key, this is the purpose. In terms of key topics, we're concerned about electoral administration, contestation of results, civil unrest, and the smoothness of transition, really. In terms of methodology, we kept our survey limited to 10 questions, and we asked our experts to give probabilistic predictions. We were lucky enough to have 17 experts participate, 8 subject matter experts and 9 trained forecasters. And the time frame for the survey was open for a week from October 8th through 15th. In terms of challenges, I would say in conducting it at this time and looking at this process, participant recruitment was a challenge. This is an extraordinarily busy time of year for university faculty and election experts, as we can all imagine. So We limited our questions given the time constraints, even though I think we all would have loved to ask a few more things. We also reached out to a really large pool of experts. We'd love to have more, but we're happy that we had a really nice balance here, and I think a solid high-level list of folks who were able to participate and share their knowledge with us. Anything you want to add on that, Juan, in terms of the mission or the design?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, we have some of the participants here as part of the attendees. So I'd like to thank all of you very much for being part of this. Because yeah, I agree that it was pretty difficult to recruit enough experts to feel comfortable with the output of these consensus predictions. So yeah, importantly, I mean, the participants are the ones who make this possible. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And then looking at key findings, first of all, there seemed to be widespread confidence that by the time we get to Inauguration Day on January 20th, we'll know who's in charge. So this story seems to very much have an end. 98, there was only a 2%, probability that we're not going to have clarity by then. 98% that we will. Folks did expect more intimidation and challenge calls this year than in prior general elections. In fact, experts predicted nearly double the volume of calls this year related to intimidation and challenges on the National Voter Protection Hotline. We also found that it's possible the race will be called election night, but seems more likely that we're going to get results several days out or even longer. There was a lot of uncertainty on this. It's unlikely, but not unthinkable, the incumbent will order interference in vote counting. It's most likely he will not concede if the race is called for the challenger. That was significant, I thought. We found the experts gave a 10% probability of domestic interference, only a 40% probability of concession by President Trump. Also, there was a nearly 1 in 5 chance the Supreme Court will be a decisive factor, 19% there. And we'll go through some subsequent slides that really show this and dig into the details a little bit further. And then finally, violence is a real concern. Again, a lot of uncertainty there. The median prediction was 60 deaths between election and Inauguration Day, and a 10% chance the Insurrection Act would be invoked. So again, not the most likely scenario by far that we would have that, but certainly if you're doing situation planning and a policymaker, you'll take note of that. And just from my perspective as someone who comes not only as an academic who's interested in American history and government, but also as someone who on the policy side has done election analysis and looked at different scenarios in different places and said, well, what's the chance of instability? What's the chance of violence? How are we thinking about that? This is where a study like this really can have value and can help folks who are looking at potential scenarios and deciding, what are the resources we need to deploy. If you see something like this, it says, okay, there's possibility of death, or there's a real possibility that we're going to have a long time before we know the results, then you're going to be staffing your security, you're going to be staffing things a bit differently, which is important to think about. So let's get into some of the more detailed findings here. So, our first question for the experts was, how many voter intimidation or challenge calls will the Election Protection National Hotline receive during this cycle? And what we see, in prior years, it was 4.7 thousand, roughly, calls of this sort that were made in the 2016 election. And our median here was 8,400. So not quite double, but almost double. And then, 75th percentile, we're seeing 13,300. So it's not unthinkable that we'll really see a high volume of contestation or concern and intimidation challenges in terms of voters trying to vote and having issues with their voting process. This is not the number of calls that would just be about, like, where's my polling place? That's actually the vast majority of calls that this hotline gets, but we looked at is really what's typically about 4% of what that hotline will receive. And Juan, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add or that you want to highlight on these. Great.
Sure.
In terms of when will the results be called, when will we know? And for us, this resolved by the Associated Press calling the results. They're usually very well staffed, following this closely and consistently take a very measured approach to these kinds of things. We're looking at a median date of November 8th. And you're seeing here, again, like we're looking at 75th percentile, November 23rd, a bump over around kind of very early December. But, you know, this is, again, we will, as we get towards January 20th, you see, we're going to know. But it looks like we could be a week, 2 weeks out, right, before we'll have this decided. And again, why is that? That's coming back to those slides that we talked about earlier. Unprecedented numbers of absentee or mail-in ballots being brought in. So for example, I was reading yesterday, just already in Pennsylvania, they've received 2 million mail-in ballots. That's roughly a third of the total votes that were cast in 2016. So what we're seeing so far kind of is reinforcing these predictions in the sense that high absentee or mail-in ballots, which will be causing some delays likely in counting. One more thing to add, of course, if it's a landslide, then we'll know. But the closer it is, the more these margins are small or may hinge on these mail-in ballots or things that may be coming in after the election. That's why we're seeing such a significant time after the election date for potential calling of the results.
Yeah, and if I can just chime in. So everyone keep in mind that these were taken toward the beginning of October when there was more uncertainty about who might win the election than there is now. I mean, clearly there is still uncertainty, but not as much as there was back in early October. So make sure you keep that in mind when looking at these results.
Great point, thank you. In terms of, one thing that we asked was, would the candidates be willing to concede? Would they be delivering a concession speech if the election is called in the other's favor? And so what we see here is are the findings for if President Trump would deliver a concession speech. The median was 40%, but again, what you see is quite a spread here in terms of the different predictions that were made. So not an area where we have a very tight, clear consensus. Certainly upwards of, someone was upwards of 70% spread, someone was below 10%. But yeah, this looks very different. I think the key, what for me struck me, was that this looks very different from when we asked this for whether Biden would concede, which was a 95% median prediction. And you see there seemed to be a consensus among the experts that this was much more likely to happen. If the election is called for in Trump's favor, much more likely that Biden would concede timely. And we define concession here, really a meaningful concession, meaning within 48 hours of the election results being called in the other's favor, not like an ever concede. Moving on, looking at would President Trump order federal agency or personnel under his authority to stop the counting of ballots, seize already cast ballots, or otherwise interfere with the tabulation process. Low likelihood, median prediction 10%, mean prediction 10%. Nobody really got above, much above 20% on that. So not impossible to imagine apparently, but certainly not likely. But if someone says there's a 10% chance of something, that is a significant concern. For me, that's a concern for me, compared to other elections. This is not something we would typically in the US be thinking much of, but certainly this year we are. Will any, and then we come to the question of really like the getting into some of the nitty gritty of the electoral college, or if things are very delayed. So we tested out two kind of questions in terms of these. So will any state legislature appoint its own slate of electors? This Juan can talk more if anyone in the Q&A wants to go into the details of Pennsylvania and the possibilities for this and the historical concerns for this. But this was a scenario that had almost happened. It had been discussed in a prior election because vote counts were taking so long. And because we expect we may have similarly long vote counts, this was why we chose to ask the question. According to the experts, this is not very likely. Again, median prediction 7%. Will the Supreme Court, however, issue a decision that determines the result of the election? Here we had notably more experts thinking that it might. So the community prediction was 19%. And you see, again, not the most likely scenario, but certainly a notable probability that it could. Juan, anything to add on those points before I move forward?
Yeah, I mean, something I'm especially eager for people to ask is if you see something notable that we haven't asked here that you might have in mind or that seems especially pressing to you, because well, Rachel and I really had to narrow down the list of questions that we had. And so we arrived at these 10 questions, but we're especially curious as to any questions that you all might have that are not covered here.
Absolutely. So feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A and we can talk it through. Then really it is important, especially for a risk survey. It felt strange asking this, quite frankly, but we did want to make sure we covered it, was how many people might die during this cycle due to election-related violence. And here we saw a median prediction of 60, the 25th percentile was 10, 75th percentile was 395. And I think what's also interesting is the shape of this as well, with kind of that tail at the end, meaning like most likely a very small number, but if things go bad, they could go very, very bad. And there's a very small remote possibility of that. So certainly for election protection folks, for security, homeland security types, this is something you would look at and be concerned about and think about how you're going to be preventing violence, mitigating risk here, prepared to respond, especially during this period, October 20th to 20 January. This is a holiday period for many people. You want to make sure you have staff, response capability, that you're not caught off guard for anything. Similarly, will President Trump invoke the Insurrection Act between November 3rd and January 20th to deploy U.S. active military or federalized National Guard forces? The scenario imagined for that would be some sort of like significant civil unrest, either in one or more key cities, most likely. You know, this is what we were thinking when we were putting this question up as a possibility. In terms of what the experts thought, median prediction 10% on this, but you do see a bit of a spread here. So some experts were thinking it was a bit more than others. So again, non-trivial, and it again tracks with the idea that there is a significant possibility of violence. So it's logical for folks to also be predicting some sort of intervention at the federal level. Again, this is rare. This is not something we commonly see, so worth considering. And then again, finally, as I started with, we get to the end, and there seemed to be great confidence that ultimately, as of 20 January, we will know who is in charge. We will know who the president is, who the powers are being exercised by. It's a bit really the path to how we get there when we know what the results are. Will there be violence? That there is cause for concern, although the most likely scenario is, of course, that things will proceed without those kinds of issues. Juan, before I just close out, anything you want to add as we've run through those results in more detail?
Yeah, so I mean, I, for one, I don't know about the attendees, but I find a lot of these results to be quite alarming. So if I am concerned about these sorts of issues, do you have any suggestions as to like how people can get involved to try to mitigate these different risks? I think that's something some folks might be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can talk about that more when we come to the Q&A as well. But let's definitely talk about that as well. And if folks have some ideas they want to throw out too, feel free to put that in the chat. In terms of links, this is, I don't need to run through these, but, just making sure we can share these later, however. Findings, I've just noted some of the different resources that Juan alluded to earlier in the introduction, and then a couple of recent pieces there. So thank you all so much for many of you for participating in this study and contributing. We hope you find these results interesting, the findings interesting, and we hope that they can be a useful guide, of course, in preventing some of these worst case scenarios that we're seeing are possible, and thinking through how we can do our best to address anything that is probable or has a significant possibility of happening. We want to be prepared. So better to be prepared for these kinds of things. All right, I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a great talk.
Very, very, very excellent. And we do have a number of questions that have been added throughout the talk. So lots of interactivity here.
Awesome.
Lloyd London asks, what, if any, cyber threats will state and local election administrators encounter with regard to voter registration databases, such as disruption attacks, DDoS, ransomware, or otherwise? So I think that's something that could be added as a particular, as a new sort of area for forecasting. But Rachel, if there are any thoughts that you want to share around this or trends that you're seeing, be great to discuss.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's an excellent point, especially so many of us are relying on the internet, are relying on our connectivity in our daily lives. So also so much has moved online. And there are huge concerns about systems vulnerabilities and protection. The US is interesting because unlike other electoral commissions or electoral systems where they're run centrally, we have a very distributed election system. Of course, every county, state boards of elections, county board of elections. So while it's unlikely to see one massive attack that would take down all election infrastructure, right, just because of the distributed nature of how we run our elections, it's not impossible to think, well, one could target a couple of different specific jurisdictions or places that are close or pivotal, focus there, find vulnerabilities, and then take advantage of them. So obviously, this is something that my understanding is that something that's very much being tracked by federal agencies such as DHS and others in terms of the cyber command and looking at particularly external threats. Foreign interference is a key concern. We saw some recent articles on Iran, on China, and others. In terms of domestic hacking, that's also something to be concerned about. My understanding is that law enforcement is aware of these kinds of threats, and it would be an interesting question. I think our expert pool probably wouldn't have been the right pool to address those likelihoods, given that they were more of the political science bent. But I think it's an important one, and one certainly I know colleagues in law enforcement and intelligence are tracking carefully. Juan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so obviously, like defining specific resolution criteria for cyber is especially difficult, just because lots of times, for instance, if we want to ask about whether Russia specifically would launch a cyber attack of some sort, sometimes it's not always that easy to attribute certain attacks to certain state actors. I just think I agree with Rachel and would like to echo that those were the sorts of questions that are like A, more difficult to clearly define, and B, our experts were mostly like electoral politics experts, not so much of the cyber domain. So we have next, I suppose, a comment from Avi Norowitz, where he outlines a scenario, and Rachel, I wonder how likely you think a scenario like this is. So he says, perhaps President Trump will legally hold on to power. The Republicans in Congress and the Supreme Court will back him, and democratic norms in the US are irreversibly eroded. So I wonder, Rachel, to what extent you think that might be the case if it actually materializes, and what the likelihood of that scenario is of materializing.
Just to make sure, so the scenario of Trump legally holding on to power and then institutions being further eroded?
Yes.
Well, I think that's something that's certainly been a critique that the left has made, and that critics of President Trump have made, in the sense of great levels of concern for the erosion of democratic institutions and norms that have governed a lot of past elections. And I think it's motivating some voters to get out, quite frankly, and vote. And that's been a concern that I've heard some folks saying, that that's partly why they're getting out to vote. This is much, for many voters, this has been more about concerns over the current president, and for opposition voters, it's been more of a protest vote in some ways than full-throated affirmation of Biden, for example. So yeah, I clearly think there is reason for concern. I don't want to get into my own partisan, personal politics on this. I think it's something that just these survey results, frankly, show. And so when you see an expert survey and you see that, one candidate 95% likely will concede if the results say he loses, and only a 40% chance that the incumbent will, that's a concern. That's something that, frankly, as a comparative person, as someone who's served overseas in places like Egypt and Jordan, and which have very different systems than we do, I would expect, a very unlikely scenario of an incumbent giving up power. This is something that we would be expecting. It's not something that you expect to see in the US when we have a long history of a very smooth transition of power. This is something that's been repeated time and time again, to the degree that Americans tend to not think about it. And so to see this divergence, I think, is evidence of cause for concern. And certainly to see some of the other things like use of the Insurrection Act, which would be a very rare move, again, certainly cause for concern about civil liberties and other things.
Yeah, I echo a lot of those thoughts. I think, well, so Avi followed up by clarifying like illegally. And so, I mean, what people want to have in mind when it comes to this is like, what's the base rate for presidents trying to illegally stay in power even after they lose an election? And I think, I mean, to my knowledge, at least, there have been no cases of that in US history. There certainly have been cases of that elsewhere, but not here. And so I think it's probably very unclear, and that's a lot of what I've read about this, that it's very unclear what the actually mechanisms there are that would come into play if President Trump just refuses to leave and wants to illegally stay in power. Yeah, it's a real risk. And I think someone commented earlier that a lot of the risk isn't even necessarily in any of these scenarios materializing or not. It's just in the fact that there is so much uncertainty, period. And I very much agree with that. So we have a comment from Steve Vetter. He says, given the much more frequent mail-in voting, having even more calls about intimidation is alarming. I think that's a very good point. I'd even think of that. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that, Rachel, but just something that comes to mind is maybe that's probably not entirely outweighed by the increase in voter turnout relative to past elections, but I wonder what you think.
Yeah, and something, I don't know where everyone is located geographically, but when we think about, for example, in New York, there's mail-in voting, you think, okay, you just mail it in, but there's also in other states, for example, in Michigan, folks are bringing their ballots to the county clerk's office or a drop box, and this is happening in different ways in different places. So even if it's a paper ballot, you may be going to a known location to bring it in. You may feel watched, or maybe a process, for validating just being able to get there to the place, to be doing that early. I think higher turnout overall is expected, so that also is something that can explain this anticipated increase in the intimidation or voter. And the other thing I think is intimidation or voter challenges, and maybe there will be some issues with, are you really, it's very contentious. And I was reading a piece recently over at the Brennan Center, and they were saying they're expecting the majority of the lawsuits that do come in be about mail-in ballots. And so how much that would, relate to the hotline. A lot of the hotline is, so-and-so said I couldn't vote, or I didn't have my thing, whatever. But I think this contentious aspect of it is an issue because we're where we haven't been before. This is new. A lot of states haven't had early voting. And I think that's another reason why it's not to see these numbers going up for the hotline. So many more days of early voting. So also people are going to their designated polling places and casting ballots, not just mail-in as well. So you do have plenty of opportunities for challenges or intimidation happening over a much longer period of time instead of just concentrating on election time.
Absolutely. We have something that I can just quickly clarify. Rung is seeking clarification as to whether President Trump has already ordered an agency like the Department of Justice or Department of Homeland Security to directly interfere in the vote count. So I'm not sure what you have in mind, but we specifically define it as President Trump ordering agents from those agencies to directly stop counting a ballot or to seize ballots that have already been cast, or otherwise get involved and interfere with the vote counting process. So that has not occurred yet. And that's what we're about specifically in that question. Then we have someone asking about trends. And then after this, I'll move on to the Q&A panel, but we have Steve asking about what we can say about trends. So did we notice anything, was there any movement in any of the questions from, in terms of probabilities of some event occurring? So I don't know if you noticed anything, Rachel, but I have not looked at that too comprehensively, but I do not think that there was anything, there was no big change as far as I'm aware, in terms of the predictions really changing for a question.
Yeah, I did look at that a bit as they were coming in, and of course there was some movement kind of in the stabilization of the predictions. I didn't, this was only open for a week, and a lot of the folks kind of predicted and didn't do further adjustments, I would say. So if we'd had it open for a longer period of time or had even more people involved, we might have seen a bit more of the back and forth, I would say. I didn't observe anything that really stuck out for me.
Yeah. And yeah, the person who asked it followed up by saying a mouse slowdown would not count under those criteria, which is correct. It would not count for that question. So moving on to the Q&A. So Jacob asks what we would say are the principal risks to democratic norms in the future. So say an election in 2024 in particular, should we be more concerned about low probability, high risk cases like Trump seizing power, or high probability, relatively low risk cases like the Supreme Court deciding a future election?
That's a great question. The way I think about that is that for, say, a low probability, high risk case like Trump seizes power, to do that successfully would require a real erosion of independence of the military. I think it would be like, just that would be the focus. And what I also see is that groups that are focused on democracy and governance are not focusing their energy there. They're focusing more on the high probability kind of low risk cases that you mentioned. I see e.g. Supreme Court decides the election. So I think when we look at the movements towards a popular vote or towards elimination of the electoral college or other kinds of constitutional amendments and legislation to really try to reduce the role of a potential court and to adjust the way our federal election system works and the electoral college works to reduce some of these touch points and some of these areas where we continually have highly contested elections, very small margins, and to shift the way the election works. That's where I see more of the movement energy going, more resources being diverted. So more, again, on those like changing how the democratic norms, they're changing a system to make it less, to reduce the perceptions that it's misaligned, I would say. Juan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think those are great points, and it goes without saying that I think a lot of risk analyses are usually for the near future. I think just because 2024, for instance, is so far off, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty around this election that's in 4 days. So I think it would be hard to forecast. Long-term forecasting is difficult. It's extremely valuable, obviously, but like even know who's running in 2024, that's extremely difficult, although it probably is worth asking questions about that. So that was a great question, Jacob.
I also think it is, just to build on that, it is really important to reinforce institutions against low probability, high risk cases. And I do think that's why we did see several senior US military leaders saying explicitly, we're not political, we're not going to step in, why you saw pressure on military coming from retired military and others to say that. So I think that even though, as you know, those are low probability, high risk cases, there has also been some push to make sure to shore up those institutions against those scenarios as well and keep them low probability.
Absolutely. We have an anonymous attendee seeking clarification on the question on how many deaths due to election-related violence there will be. So I pulled this up, and the consensus prediction is that there will be, that there's an 8% chance of over 1,000 deaths. So not quite as alarming as 20%, but still really alarming. I think like the impression I at least got from the answers to that question is that there are really two scenarios that would occur in that case. The most likely scenario by far is either scattered violence at various places throughout the country, probably resulting in a low number of deaths because there was a large spike toward the zero end of the probability distribution. And then there's a long tail risk of many, many deaths And that's where we get the 8% of over 1,000 deaths. So if things go, I read the 8% as like, if things go catastrophically wrong, there's an 8% chance of that many deaths occurring. What do you think, Rachel?
Exactly. And of course it's not 20, it's not, luckily it's not a 20% chance of over 1,000 deaths, but it's still a cause for concern. I think when we're even asking the question and we're looking at non-trivial percentages, like 8% chance of massive disruption, what's going on there? What we saw were the experts, they do think about, and many of you included in this group, like thought very carefully about the different scenarios and the likelihoods of making those answers. So what I take away as someone who's, again, works both in policy and on the academic side is like, yeah, this is cause for concern. It's definitely cause for concern. And again, like we're asking, as noted sort of earlier, this has been an unstable year in the United States. We have seen violence, we have seen clashes, thankfully, we haven't seen, massive casualty scenarios, but it's certainly something to be worried about.
Absolutely. Corey asks if there will be an analysis of forecaster versus subject matter expert predictions and performance. So there will definitely be an analysis of performance overall. I mean, we would like to know how accurate both the experts, the subject matter experts and the generalist forecasters were overall. Because obviously if they're not all that accurate, then there's a lot less value in this work. But I mean, I for one predict that they will be fairly accurate if the Metaculus track record is any indication of that. And also, the point of those collaborations is that they probably supplement each other. Both the generalist forecasters bring on their expertise in forecasting, and then the subject matter experts bring their expertise in whatever the domain is, in this case, US electoral politics. So I expect they will do quite well. We will see. I'm not yet sure we will do an analysis directly comparing them, but that might be a smaller part of an overall analysis of the performance, the accuracy of everyone involved. Sylvain asks or comments saying that an interesting addition to the survey would be some way to estimate correlations between these predictions, and he expects them to be high. So I'm especially interested in what you think about this, Rachel, but yeah, that does sound right to me, and that, for instance, a very clear correlation between questions would be between President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act and there being over 1,000 deaths. I think a lot of those probabilities between 2% and 20% that were assigned to various questions, they probably do correlate significantly. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Rachel?
Yeah, I agree. There are things that when you look at them, you feel like these must be, there's some sort of a connection there. It'd be interesting to tease that out more. And also in the subject matter versus forecasters, I smiled because I asked Juan that as well. And I thought it was interesting. It's like, well, you kind of you wonder a little bit, how do political scientists see these questions through a lens that might be different than someone who's an expert forecaster? Does one mode of inquiry lend itself to addressing these questions in a certain way as opposed to others? And while we didn't look at that, I one to think about, especially as Metaculus considers looking at areas of knowledge that are maybe not as science and tech, but looking at these kinds of political science questions and others. It's certainly an area where I wonder if there might be different perspectives on things. But as you saw, actually, in fact, in a lot of these questions, a few had quite a bit of spread that was different, but there was actually quite a bit of consensus on a lot of things. And then there's just a lot of uncertainty overall. One other thing that in terms of other research, we don't have the benefit of prior surveys about these same questions. You know, it would be interesting to ask how much of an outlier is this year compared to 4 years ago. You know, how many deaths were predicted in 2016, right? Like, it's my sense that these would have been like questions not asked or not predicted, but also it's a thing to think about. Maybe this is something that Metaculus might consider repeating in subsequent years to develop a sort of record over time as well, with these kinds of questions, because then you could compare historically.
Yeah, I mean, this survey is really a standalone survey, and yeah, it would be extremely helpful if we could make comparisons, but yeah, since it is a standalone survey, that's quite difficult. I would like to next address Steve Vedder's question on what we can say about other Metaculus questions that were not part of this study, but are closely related. So I can comment a little bit on that. We recently hosted the 2020 Insight Forecasting Contest, and I put up one of the especially interesting results that's related to election risks for the upcoming US election. And this question asks about the US election and whether it's conceded by November 17th, 2020. And the Metaculus consensus prediction is 87%, and the unweighted consensus prediction is 61%. So I think since this was more recent, something that's especially interesting is how people incorporate the information regarding who the winner of the election will actually be. So I think I might have hinted at this earlier, in that it was probably, I mean, the Democratic nominee Biden was less of a favorite at the beginning of October relative to in the past few days. So that might be a big part of it. But yeah, we do have other questions like in that 2020 Insight tournament that we recently hosted that are along these lines of risks to the election. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other questions. Oh, so Avi asks, do the expert forecasters and subject matter experts talk to one another to try to improve their forecasts? So would you like to take that on, Rachel?
Yeah, they have an option in the platform to comment and to interact with each other. And there was some commentary interaction. We didn't do like a focus group where they talked and kind of talked through these kinds of things. So it was very much just through the platform. We did see some interaction. Not so much deep persuasion of others as one could imagine, but certainly some exchange. Juan?
Yeah, there was some exchange, but I think the political science experts in particular were especially time constrained. And so even in the COVID expert surveys, which I mentioned very previously in the introduction, which is the surveys modeled after those surveys, with subject domain experts, it's difficult to get them as involved as our generalist forecasters from the Metaculus platform are.
Yeah, I would say we did get really positive feedback from folks who did participate, and a number of them shared that they'd really enjoyed the experience from the political science group. Quite a few folks, said, I would love to, but I don't have the time. And even those who said that they would participate were like, I really don't have a lot of time for this. So again, the constraints on folks' time, especially coming at that moment in October with the switch to online learning, with so much uncertainty, and COVID issues in university, we just wanted to be also mindful of the context that we're conducting the survey in overall too, in the sense that there's just a lot that everyone is dealing with. And so we're grateful that folks were able to participate in whatever capacity they were, and hope that it provided a good platform for exchange and for thinking through some of these really important questions.
Totally. So I see we're almost out of time. So Rachel, do you have any final thoughts or comments or anything you would like to share with our attendees before we close things out?
Well, again, I just want to say thank you to all of you who contributed. Huge thank you to Juan, who came to me with this idea, and I thought it was really an interesting proposition. Was pretty excited to be on board. To Guy and the rest of the team at Metaculus for really building this platform, which provides a fascinating way for folks to collaborate, to share ideas, and to tackle some tough questions, and to really try to put a number on it. And I think that's the key here, and what this really adds is that we can all throw up our hands and think, oh, so many disasters are possible, but really, what is the probability? What, when we think through, because that has major implications for where we should be putting our time, our resources, our personnel. And I think what I came away with from this survey is, like, if you're concerned, there's reason to be concerned, and reason to be prepared. Unfortunately, it's really not a normal year when I see these kinds of numbers for the states. Not something I think is ordinary. But at the same time, I think that the majority, the most probable scenarios are not, mass destruction and whatever. So it's also thinking through, well, what between now and the occurrence, can we do to really prevent any kind of unrest, to make this election safe, fair, clear, transparent, to protect voters, to protect civilians, and to ensure a smooth transition of power like we've had in the past. I think that's the ultimate goal for everyone who's invested in this democracy and in these institutions, is, to think through, okay, we have some real concerns, what's possible to mitigate, whether it's getting people out to staff the voter protection lines and hotlines, and to be poll observers, poll workers, to donate so that boards of elections locally have the scanning machines they need to move through these kinds of ballots effectively, to the folks on the legal side who are pushing through cases to try to see how much can we resolve before election date, which is always optimal. You want optimally to know the ground rules before you go. So all of that, I appreciate all of those efforts, applaud them, and encourage everyone to do what they can. And also in terms of, on the information side and media side, which I think is huge, that we should all moderate our own expectations in terms of when will we know results. This isn't an instant gratification election. This is an election where we are likely, it's as we see from this survey, it is more than likely we're going to be a week out, or 5 days, maybe longer out before we know results. So to counsel, to remind others that this is something that we predicted ahead of time, we saw coming. It's not the end of the world. It's quite reasonable given the circumstances. And so we all just have to sit tight until results are out. And I think just making sure that we can help to calm others, and to reinforce that if there are delays, they're not unforeseen or unexplainable, that it's just part of the process working the way it should be given these conditions. So
I agree with all of your thoughts, and just thank you so much, Rachel, for collaborating with us on this project. Your input has been super valuable, and we really appreciate all of the work you put in to help us with this. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees for coming, learning more about what these different risks are, what they can do. And I'd like to thank all of our participants, of course, some of whom are here. And we couldn't have done this without them, of course. So thank you everyone for coming. Stay tuned for future events that will be of this nature. And thank you so much. That is all. Thank you.
thanks all. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thanks again, Rachel. Really appreciate it. And for all those in the US, don't forget to vote. Don't forget to vote. We'll sign off, and we will be posting this video if you'd like to review it, or if you'd like to share it with others. It will be available soon on our YouTube channel. We'll be sending it out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you soon.